There won't be many of you that don't recognise this image, the Jarrow March. October 1936, 207 men walked 300 miles from Jarrow on Tyneside to the Palace of Westminster, demanding food and jobs for their town. We remember it because it's in the public memory. We're taught about it at school, we've seen the newsreels. We all feel empathy and sympathy for these men who were so brave to walk all that way. But few of you will have heard of a similar march that happened 23 years earlier. It was the Women's Suffrage Pilgrimage. Women from all over the country marched to London for a mass rally in Hyde Park to demand the vote. They weren't the suffragettes, they were the suffragists. They were the peace-loving, law-abiding women that had been working for the vote for many years. They came in 5 strands. They came across the country from Cardiff, they came up from Cornwall, they came across from East Anglia, they came down the country from the northeast, and a contingent came down from Carlisle. All along the way, they stopped at places and they held rallies and meetings, and women joined them as they came, thousands and thousands thronging in London on the 26th of July. Here is the poster for the contingent that walked from Cumbria. You can see that they were following the Watling Street route, which is an old Roman road, and Roman roads, as we know, run straight. But if you have a look there, on the 8th of July, they came to Congleton. Why on earth would they come to Congleton, I asked. But if you look at the map, you will see that the day before they were at Nantwich, then they came to Congleton, and then they moved on to Stoke. And looking at the map, ignoring of course the M6, which wasn't there in 1913, you will see it's a straight line from Nantwich to Stoke. So why do this dog's leg to Congleton? Well, they came to Congleton for one reason and one reason only, and that was to say hello to Elizabeth Wolstenholme Elmy. Elizabeth was a famous suffragist, and at this time she was 81 years old and very frail. When the women arrived in Congleton, they held a rally in our fairground, which was much bigger than it is today, and a contingent of women broke away and walked up Buxton Road to Elizabeth's house, where they had tea with Elizabeth. Elizabeth was very tiny and very frail, but she still had the heart of a lion, and she was so annoyed that she couldn't get down to the fairground and give an address to the women. She insisted that they saddle up her little pony, Vixen, and getting her on her back, she went with the women down into Congleton. And from there, she led the parade, the March of Women, for a short way as they left the town. I love that picture. Can you imagine Elizabeth, the women, their banners waving? A sort of secular Palm Sunday. And I just have a little bit of poetic license, but I just imagine her sitting on Vixen, watching them as they disappeared, symbolically handing on the baton, saying, "Go on, sisters, go and get that vote." But who is Elizabeth? Because we don't know. I had to really dig to find out about her. She's been very much forgotten and hidden from history, and yet she did amazing things. She was born in 1833, the second child of Reverend Joseph Wolstenholme and his wife Elizabeth. Elizabeth's mother, died within a week of Elizabeth's birth, which was very common in those days. Women died in childbirth all the time. And Elizabeth was brought up for a short while by her maternal grandparents. Now, in those days, girls and women had very little of any rights. They were literally the property of their father, and when they married, their husband. Unlike her brother, who was given an education and ended up as a mathematics don in Cambridge University. But poor old Elizabeth, who was equally as bright, was given hardly any education at all and fought hard to get just 2 years of formal education between the ages of 13 and 15 at Full Neck in Leeds. Elizabeth felt this extremely badly. She hated the fact that she couldn't have an education, and she embarked on a lifelong mission of self-education. She read the works of Mary Wollstonecraft and began to really question her father about the Christian faith and the fact that women were subjugated to men. This came to a head when she was about 12 years old and was a bridesmaid for her cousin. Was absolutely appalled to hear the father give away his daughter in marriage and her cousin promise to obey her husband. She vowed never to marry, and she vowed never to go to a church wedding again. From that point on, Elizabeth ceased to be a Christian and believe in God. Elizabeth wanted very much to be a teacher, and to fund her studies, she taught private lessons to local children, and eventually she took a job as a governess down south. When her grandfather died, he left her a small legacy, and Elizabeth moved back to Worsley and opened a small girls' school. Girls were taught very badly in those days, but Elizabeth's curriculum was full. She taught her girls exactly what boys were being taught, so that her girls could be independent and earn their own money if they wanted to. In 1866, Elizabeth Wolstenholme was the first woman to speak before a parliamentary commission when she stood before the Taunton Commission and spoke to advocate girls' right to education. The Act was passed, the Education Act, the following year, and because of Elizabeth, it had been changed so that all children from the age of 5 to 13 would have a state education, both boys and girls. This was a big step forward because before this, children could be sent out to work from an early age and never get an education at all, particularly girls. At about the same time, Elizabeth met with a woman called Josephine Butler. And Josephine Butler was heading a campaign against something called the Contagious Diseases Act. The Contagious Diseases Act was a terrible discriminatory act that was aimed at women prostitutes, sex workers. There was a problem at the time with sexually transmitted diseases in garrison towns and ports where the men and the soldiers, the sailors, were coming in. And so, of course, there's no women in Parliament to make the laws, so the men decided that it was the women's fault. And they passed this law. And this law meant that any policeman who saw a woman walking in the streets on her own, and he just thought she might be a prostitute, or maybe she had a little bit too much money, they would arrest her, take her to the police station, forcibly, intimately examine her, and if they found that she had a sexually transmitted disease, she'd be put in a lock hospital and kept there until she was deemed clean. It was a prison, really, nothing more than that. I found a quotation from a prostitute at the time, or maybe even just a young woman who had fallen foul of this law, and this is what she said. "It is men, only men, from the first to the last, that we have to deal with. To please a man, I did wrong at first. Then I was flung about from man to man. Men, police, laid hands on me. By men, we were examined, handled, doctored. In the hospital, it is men again who make prayers and make us read the Bible. We are had up before magistrates who are men, and we never get out of the hands of men until we die. I think that's a very sad quote. Elizabeth couldn't campaign openly against this act because as a single woman, it wasn't proper that she knew about such things. She would have been pilloried had she got on a platform and spoke about sexually transmitted diseases. But Josephine could, because Josephine was a respectable married woman. They led a very successful campaign, and in 1886 that act was taken off the statute books. By 1867, Elizabeth's school was extremely successful and she needed bigger premises. So her school moved from Worsley in Manchester to Congleton in Cheshire, and she set up a school in Moody Hall in Moody Street. And it was there that she met the love of her life, one Benjamin John Elmy, or Ben for short. Ben was an accomplished poet and essayist, an ardent feminist just like her, and a member of the Victorian free love movement. Ben wrote books under the pseudonym Ellis Ethelmar, and he wrote an epic poem called Woman Free, about women and about their need for emancipation and equality with men. He also wrote a series of small books for children, young-aged children from 6 upwards, to young girls, teenage girls. And these explained to them how their bodies worked, told them about sex, and told them about how not to get pregnant. And this was in 1867. This is not 1960s, this is 1860s. This is how far advanced Elizabeth and Ben were. And these little books that used flowers and birds to tell children about their bodies were used by Elizabeth in her school in Moody Hall. But what was the free love movement? Because Elizabeth was part of it as well. Well, when I first heard free love, I immediately thought about the 60s again. I thought about hippies, and I imagined Ben and Elizabeth, with the floral caftans and a bell and flowers in their hair. But that's not quite what it meant. For a woman in those days, owned by men as they were, marriage was a very serious thing. If you owned property or had any money of your own, as soon as you married, under the law of the land, it became your husband's. A law that goes back to feudal times, really, called coverture. A man owned his wife, so anything that was hers was his. So a woman had 3 choices. She either capitulated and married and gave up everything, or she remained a spinster with chastity, or she could have a free union. And that's what the free love movement was all about. Basically, it meant a couple lived together. We think nothing of it now, but in those days it was a very serious thing. And Ben and Elizabeth embarked upon a free union, and they lived together in Congleton, unmarried. As you can tell, the people of the time in quiet little Congleton didn't think that was a very good idea. They didn't like change. And unfortunately, Ben and Elizabeth were not very well thought of. They were sort of outside polite society, if you like, because of this. Ben and Elizabeth, both great ardent supporters of education and wanted women to get as much education as they can, because they recognised that it was only education that was going to free women. It was only if they could earn their own money that they were going to be free from the tyranny of men. And so they embarked on lectures and lessons for the workers around Congleton. Ben owned 3 small mills at the time, and he was the first man in the country, the first mill owner, to pay women their own wages. Until Ben Elmy, a man could turn up at the mill gates and get his wife's wages and go and drink it in the pub, or even go and get his daughter's wages. So Ben said, no, if a woman works for me, a woman gets paid by me. And so they were doing in the co-op hall, these series of lectures, helping them to become educated. And it was because of this that they invited from London Annie Besant and Charles Braidlaw. They invited them to come and do a series of lectures on another of their favourite topics, secularism. As you can imagine, the powers that be in Congleton at the time were most dismayed that this famous woman was coming to talk about women's rights and atheism. And so they refused to allow them to use the town hall for the lectures. This didn't stop Ben and Elizabeth. A fellow mill owner that owned Salford Mill, a big mill in Congleton, gave them the use of his property to hold the lectures, and the lectures went ahead. But the powers that be paid a local ruffian to stir up a mob, and stir it up he did indeed. He got a group of people outside the mill chanting and singing hymns and throwing bricks and stones and mud at the windows of the mill as Annie was speaking. A large stone came through the window and struck Annie on the head, cutting her deeply. But it didn't stop her. She finished her lecture. And at the end of the lecture, Annie Besant, Charles Braidlaw, Ben and Elizabeth walked home through Congleton and through the park with this crowd, a baying mob following them, throwing stones and singing, "What a friend we have in Jesus." The night after, the second lecture went ahead. And again, there was riots, this time inside the hall. The ruffian had managed to smuggle himself into the hall, and as the meeting was starting, challenged Charles Braidlaw to a fight. So Braidlaw said, "Okay then," rolled up his sleeves, jumped into the hall, and a great big riot started, a big fight. He beat the ruffian and actually threw him out of the mill. But they stayed outside, again singing and chanting and throwing stones. This time, a large stone came through the window and struck poor Elizabeth, cutting her above the eye, and she carried the scar for the rest of her life. In 1871, Elizabeth gave up her school in Congleton to become the first woman ever to be employed by the women's movement. She was employed to lobby Parliament, and lobby she did. At this point in time, she was writing over 300 letters a day by hand. She wrote to every single MP at least once. She was only 5 foot, well, less than 5 foot in height, and yet they were terrified of her. They called her the scourge of the Commons, or the parliamentary watchdog. Later on, Elizabeth became pregnant. This is very serious in those days. As an unmarried woman, to be pregnant was a disgrace. And the Christian religious women of the suffragettes and suffragists demanded that she resign her post because they felt that Elizabeth was bringing the movement into disrepute. Elizabeth resigned, but it didn't stop her. She carried on working just as hard as she ever did. Just before her son Frank was born, Ben and Elizabeth went through a registry office ceremony to be married. I am not sure why they did that. It was against everything that they'd always said. It was against all their beliefs, but I suspect it was probably that they did it for the sake of their son, because to be born illegitimate in those days had a huge stigma with it. And so they went to the registry office in London. But Elizabeth, sticking to as many of her principles as she possibly could, refused to wear a ring. And she refused to promise to obey Ben. And Ben, in support of Elizabeth, took her name as well as his own, and they became the Wolstenholme Elmys, both of them using both of the names from then on. But they couldn't do without Elizabeth for very long in the women's movement. She was very soon invited back and was back as active as ever. In the 1880s, Ben and Elizabeth were very short of money. They weren't a rich couple and they used most of their money up for the many campaigns that they did. But it also, the 1880s, fetched them some great triumphs. They'd been working hard and campaigning, over 1,600 petitions and over 6,000 letters they wrote to try and get the Married Women's Property Act, which came in 1882 and was a milestone for women's rights. This was the first domino in the process of women getting equality. The Married Women's Property Act allowed women to keep property in their own name if they got married, to have a bank account in their own name and to keep their own money. It was a tremendous move forward, and it was down to Elizabeth and Ben and their campaigning that women can do that today. It was followed up in 1886 by the Guardianship of Infants Act, which gave women rights over their own children. Before this, if a couple parted, the father would take the children because they belonged to him, and sometimes mothers never saw their children again. But as I said, it took the toll on their finances, and then a massive blow hit them at the end of the 1880s when Ben's mill at Eaton Bank suffered a disastrous fire and they lost all their money and had to sell up. Elizabeth was tired and decided to retire and settle into what she thought would be a long retirement. But in 1891, something happened that brought Elizabeth rushing back out of retirement. It was the Clithero Case. And what had happened was a man had married a woman, presumably for her money, and then immediately left the country and went to live abroad. After several years, he returned back to England. He'd probably spent the money, and he wanted to take up where he'd left off. He literally wanted to walk back into this woman's life and take over. Of course, she said, "No way, Jose," or Victorian words to that effect, and refused to do so, refused to let him in. So one morning in Clithero in Lancashire, as this poor woman left church, she was kidnapped by this man and held prisoner, demanding his conjugal rights. Of course, this was everything that Elizabeth had been fighting against. This was curvature. This is what she hated most. This is what she was fighting. And she came rushing out of retirement and took up this case. Knowing the law as well as she did from her time lobbying Parliament, Elizabeth stood up and advocated for this woman. No shrinking violet now. Elizabeth was not afraid of what society was thinking, like she was in the Contagious Diseases campaign. No, Elizabeth stood on a public platform and in a court of law and talked about marital rape, a shocking thing that people, even men, didn't talk about in public. They won their case, and Elizabeth was absolutely overjoyed, as I'm sure Mrs. Jackson was as well. And when she came out of court, she said, "That's it, curvature is over, I have won." Sadly, a sad fact, that piece of legislation wasn't changed officially, wasn't taken off the statute book until the Sexual Offences Act of 2002. And even though that was changed then, as short a time ago as 2017, a High Court judge said this: "It is a man's fundamental human right to have sex with his wife." No mention of her fundamental right to say no. The 1890s saw Ben and Elizabeth back in harness, fighting for the vote. And in 1903, Elizabeth, along with her friend Emmeline Pankhurst, set up the WSPU, and was there on the night that the words were first shouted, deeds, not words. Emmeline referred to Elizabeth as the brains behind the suffragist movement. In 1905, Elizabeth got together a contingent of like-minded MPs who were in favour of women getting the vote, and they put a bill forward in Parliament to pass an act giving women the vote. But there was an opposing group of MPs who didn't want women to get the vote, and they talked the bill out. They filibustered, they told jokes and spoke about motor cars until the time had gone and the bill was thrown out. Elizabeth was so angry. Herself and Emmeline Pankhurst led hundreds of women into Parliament in protest, and Elizabeth climbed onto the statue of Richard I and gave a rousing speech. She was 71 years old when she did that. In 1908, she was honoured by the women at a huge meeting at the Queen's Hall in London. Hundreds and hundreds of women came to the hall to give her the honour of Nestor. They gave her an award. Nestor means wise one, wise woman, and Elizabeth was thrilled. It was the thing that she was most proud of in her life. But on the night it happened and they led her into the hall, all the women stood and cheered and clapped. And Elizabeth looked round to see what was happening, who's come in, and had to be told, "This is for you, Elizabeth." In 1911, there was a huge parade through London for the vote, and Elizabeth was given pride of place. She's on the balcony. Underneath her is a huge banner, and as the women walked past, they lowered their banners in honour of her. But all wasn't well between Emmeline Pankhurst and Elizabeth. You see, Elizabeth was happy to break the law because she thought that the law was wrong because it oppressed women. But she was never willing to threaten life and endanger life. And when the suffragettes started planting their bombs and sending letter bombs and fire and making fires, Elizabeth said, "What madness has got hold of you? What are you doing? Somebody is going to die." And so in 1912, Elizabeth broke away from the Pankhursts and the suffragettes. Which brings me full circle right back to 1913, her last public appearance here in Congleton, sat on Little Vixen watching the women march past. I've just touched on a few of the things Elizabeth did. She did so many more things, committees and women's groups. She fought for so many causes, and I've just picked the ones that I find most interesting. I hope that you've enjoyed my little film, and I'd like to wish you all a happy International Women's Day. Thank you.